So let me start with you, Luong Minh. ASEAN is at the heart of one of the most dynamic regions of the world, growing at an extraordinary pace with great challenges to boot on a whole range of fronts. What is ASEAN doing to try not just to achieve development and growth, but sustainability, which reaches all the populations and is sort of sustainable for the long term in terms of the environment and other priorities as well?
For decades now, ASEAN has been in the process of building a community based on three pillars: the political security pillar, the economic pillar, and the social cultural pillar. During the process of building community, ASEAN attaches great importance to equitable development and narrowing the gap of development. Back in 1998, very early in the process of this community building, ASEAN adopted the Hanoi Plan of Action with concrete measures to narrow the gap of development among the ASEAN countries and to promote the economic integration of the new members of ASEAN. And then in 2000, ASEAN further adopted what we call the Initiative for ASEAN Integration. And we have been so far implementing the second phase of this initiative, which has already two phases, spanning from 2002 until 2015. Again, with the concrete measures to narrow the gap of development among the older ASEAN countries, and the four new countries, members of ASEAN, namely Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. And furthermore, in 2010, ASEAN adopted the framework agreement on the equitable development, with measures to ensure inclusive development, inclusive growth, and that target poverty reduction, and also the development of the small and medium enterprises, which constitute the backbone of the ASEAN economies. And all these are aimed at ensuring, a balance between economic growth, economic development, and equity, and again, to ensure that in ASEAN we are able to sustain the economic growth, economic development, while at the same time ensuring equity, and the benefits of economic growth will be found by all the people of ASEAN.
Is there a trade-off between growth and equity and sustainability, or does broadening the reach of development and broadening the capacities across the whole population and treating the environment responsibly, does that actually help long-term growth, or are they at odds? Do we have to choose one or the other?
No, we don't choose, and we cannot choose between one or another. But otherwise, we are trying to overcome, that challenge. Actually, in ASEAN, many of the ASEAN economies are agricultural-based. Whose main products are agricultural products. So while agriculture, promote economic growth in ASEAN, that also has impact. Many impact on the environment. And this is the challenge that we have to overcome. But we are not choosing one among the two. But we are trying that to see that while we are promoting economic development, economic growth, we are also protecting the environment with a view to ensuring equitable development and equity.
Afsaneh, the world population is expected to grow to 10 billion, with much of that in Africa and in Asia, along with the Middle East and Latin America. Emerging markets are racing forward. They need to grow in order to feed their own populations and give people an opportunity to develop. Where is the money, the resources, the investment going to come from to fund all this development?
If we look at the public sector versus the private sector, in sort of our lifetime, a lot has changed. It used to be that most of the resources going into these countries was public sector when we all started our careers. And I think that has changed. If you look at the size of the markets, for example, if you look just at the size of equity markets in emerging markets, it's something like 17 trillion. If you look at the local bond markets, it's something like 14 billion. If you look at the size of World Bank lending, depending on whether you look at lending or commitments, different numbers between 40 and 60 billion. So just we go from trillions to billions. And then there are a few obviously other multilateral organizations putting out money. So the relationship between these numbers has changed hugely. As you said, there is a need for capital to move into these countries. You talked about food and education, health, etc. But there's also energy. In order to grow, you need energy. We know a lot of these countries are at suboptimal growth because if you don't have enough power, if you don't have enough roads, you are basically growing. If you're Nigeria, if you're Kenya, if you're Iran, if you're Bangladesh, you're growing 3 to 4% below your potential, even if you have other good policies. So there is a lot of need in these countries. I think the big question to really think about is the public sector has always thought more broadly. The private sector has thought capital plus labor, I'm simplifying, and most of us who studied economics, traditional economics, capital plus labor, productivity, and so on and so forth. And you look at growth using two factors models. If you look really at what we're talking about today, and what I think most economists are starting to realize, is that it is capital and labor, but it is also people's well-being, it's also water, it is also the earth, it is also the air. And so these are all, we did not put a value on those other ones when we were doing traditional economic training and traditional economic teaching. And if you start looking at all the factors that we need in order to be able to produce goods, I think private and public sector would get closer. Right now, and I'll just say one other thing, is that the private sector looks at growth in a more narrow way. And I think the public sector can play a very important role to help the private sector realize that you can make money and also have cleaner energy or have better health in these countries.
Okay, so let me take the same follow-up to you, which is, does including these other factors, human well-being, environmental sustainability, and so forth, does that come at the expense of old-fashioned growth, or is it on the side simply as an externality, or does it actually help and boost traditional sorts of growth measures?
I think it helps to boost. Again, all of this depends on how you do it, obviously. For example, let's take the health sector. Health sector in private markets, in emerging markets, last year, which was, we've all been reading the terrible numbers in emerging markets. Just look at the health sector in emerging markets, private sector, how well that did. So that is your answer. Health sector, private sector in emerging markets did really, really well in the last 12 months. Emerging markets as a general went down more than 10%. We now realize that some of the things we care about, in fact, do provide good returns. Again, most of the time when we talk about clean energy, it's supposed to be a tax on the economy, right? But I've worked on many projects, and you all have worked on many projects, where let's say if you replace coal to natural gas, not perfect, it still is a hydrocarbon. You improve the cost, you improve the efficiency, and you improve the environment. And you have a very reasonable rate of return. There are many cases like that across the emerging world where we can all jointly make a bigger effort.
So to both of you, we've just recently seen the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, come into being, replacing the MDGs, the Millennial Development Goals. What is your take on the SDGs, and do you think they're going to be effective, and are they going to affect what you do in significant ways?
Actually, I mean, the measures that we are undertaking in ASEAN to promote economic development, economic growth, and equitable development, they are aligned to the ASEAN MDG, to the UN MDGs. And it is our intention that, in the vision that we are now developing for ASEAN to continue the process of community building and integration beyond the 15. We are intending to align our priorities to those of the UN I mean, in the new Sustainable Development Goals. And already, also, it's one of the essential elements of that vision that we are now developing to be endorsed by the leaders of ASEAN at this coming summit in November, to ensure that, in the period beyond 2015, we are able to ensure not only balance, but also concerted and sustained progress on all the three pillars of the community that I mentioned, the political security pillar, economic pillar, and the social cultural pillar.
Afsaneh, what are your take on the SDGs?
My take is that it's a policy statement, and it's a great policy statement as far as policy statements go. I think what is missing is you have policy statements, you have execution, and what is missing is sort of where you end the policy and the statements that are being made and how you actually turn them into real projects, which is what a lot of people here are interested in. And I think it is up to the that is where the public sector can play a much bigger role. That's where the NGOs and a lot of development institutions, a lot of foundations all over the world can play a much bigger role in actually identifying how do you turn this policy into a real project. So if we want to improve, let's say, climate change, if we want to reduce poverty, that's a great goal. But how are we doing it? Again, I worked at the World Bank for 20 years, and we were trying to reduce poverty in Africa. That was sort of a major goal. And it's very interesting right now in my private sector world, where we're managing a 500 million, not huge, fund in Africa. We're doing so much, and the private sector is doing so much together with the public sector. But it is in the sorts of things you're going to hear about, the Equity Bank, what they ended up doing. Having local entrepreneurs in Africa become empowered and have capital and have the backing of their governments to be able to produce new goods in Africa. That is what you need. So it is really turning those policies into the end product that will help reduce poverty. And I see a huge gap there.
So ASEAN, I mean, piggybacking on that, ASEAN has been notable. So many of its countries have managed to claw their way up the developmental ladder in extremely impressive ways that many other regions would kill for. And they've done so often through not just public-private collaboration, but also through development of an indigenous economic base, authentic industries, rather than simply aid, rather than simply external charity. What are the sort of learnings for development that come from the ASEAN experience?
I mentioned, the agreement that we signed in 2010, which is the framework agreement on equitable development, when we attach its importance to the development of the ASEAN small and medium enterprises, which constitute the backbone of many ASEAN economies. Up to 51 to 97% of ASEAN product are produced by those SMEs in ASEAN, and in process of building and also consolidating the community, we also see the very important role played by the private sector and the charity sector. Actually, in this last year of the community building, roadmap, we are developing an idea, of building a more and really people-oriented, people-centered community, where the principle of consultations, the principle of the broad participation of the own spectrum of the ASEAN population in the ASEAN affairs. And of course, among them, the private sectors and the charity sectors are most important. What also we are promoting in ASEAN, the corporate social responsibility.
So, Clinton Global Initiative is all about translating, as everyone says, ideas into action. What practical lessons, when you look back on the things you've been involved in, what practical lessons for people who want to do things that actually work have you learned? And including, you get extra points for negative lessons, things you shouldn't do that you tried that sounded like a good idea but ultimately didn't actually pan out. So what are some of the chief learnings you would recommend to individuals and organizations and countries based on your experiences with these issues?
So first of all, do what is real. I remember when I started my career, my first job, I walked into the World Bank and they said, could you look at the poverty indicators of these pipelines we're building? This was oil pipelines from within an Asian country, in fact, and look at the poverty indicators. So I said, where do I look? And they said, you have to kind of make up the numbers. And it was the time when, Bob McNamara used to like lots of numbers. So just come up with a number. So I think, what you have to do is what you really think will make a difference. And I think what happens in a lot of institutions is there's a lot of, think of something just like that. But the other side of it is entrepreneurial. Think of some real examples. And I see the real examples that have made a big difference is really the people who understood policy, to be involved in coming up, turning that policy and coming up with the next 5 projects. The point is that the public sector has the huge advantage of leverage on its side. When you leverage in public sector, the benefits goes to whether it's the poor or whatever the population is that's benefiting from that area. When you leverage in the private sector, it's great, but the benefits go to the investors in the private sector, obviously. The beneficiaries will be the beneficiaries of the service providers. So the question is, how do you put together the incentive schemes between the public sector and the private sector, come up with a list of, let's say, 5 things. What are we doing on a World Resources Institute? We looked at our own endowment and realized that if your World Resources Institute, your endowment better be sensitive to climate change and water shortage and deforestation and things like that. We came up with ways to look at how real projects were. As we started looking, it wasn't easy. It's really, really hard to identify the ways that you can make a difference because a lot of the studies that have been done, a lot of benchmarks that are out there are not real yet. So we are now creating a real benchmark, a real way that based on our organization's, let's say, goals, will help to improve the water situation in certain countries, improve energy efficiency, but also make sure that our endowment is making money. So I think that's pretty practical. It's very small, but we can make a big difference.
Mr. Minh, how about you? Any learnings, anything that Vietnam did or that ASEAN has done that you say, in retrospect, that was a well-intentioned idea, but it didn't quite work, so don't try that one?
I think there are 2 lessons that in ASEAN we have learned. First, in ASEAN we have, the scorecard system to follow, with the progress of community building, the figures keep changing from 80% to 90% and now 93% of all the measures we have designed for the community building process. And still people are debating, if we are already, on track towards, building, realizing that community. And then we say, it's not even the figures. It's not even, how many measures you have implemented or how many agreements you have, concluded. But the impact are most important. And for the people, to really benefit from the implementation of those measures, the design of those measures must, be people focused, and that's why now we are, promoting very, the important idea of making the community more people-oriented and people-centered community. And the second lesson is, that whenever you have the institutional capacity to support whatever measures you have taken, then you succeed. So besides the agreements, the commitments, you have to develop the institutional capacity for implementing those measures. Because actually in ASEAN, we, despite of the great number of agreements and commitments we have undertaken at the regional level, the problem is at the level of national implementation. And that's for the very reason that we do have, I mean, at the national level, that institutional capacity to implement the agreements.
I could talk with you guys all day, but we have a great audience here. We want to bring them into the discussion since they have expertise and questions as well. So let's take some questions from our fellow participants here. Who wants to start it off? Anybody? Okay, yes, over here.
Oh, great. Yeah, okay, I'll be brave. Hopefully somebody will have a good question next. So I've done a lot of work. I think, first of all, we all agree that multi-sector is the way to go, so that's great. I've done a lot of work. Some of it is what I call linear model, and some of it is what I would call a circular model. Circular model is where you might take something, and it's kind of a 360, and you say there's 10 things we need to do in this village or whatever to solve the problem that we're looking at, and we surround ourselves and you solve it, but it's a very small scale that you can do it. So it's sustainable and replicable, but it's small scale. Linear is more like where you would look through a supply chain and you take one issue and you kind of solve it along, but like you could solve food security, but without education, without sanitation, without all these other things, you don't actually solve the ultimate problem in terms of quality of life or economic contribution, et cetera. I wondered if you had any thoughts on what you've seen in models, whether circular, linear works better, and particularly when you're talking about scale. What's the best way to scale?
I'm personally not a believer that one model works and another model doesn't work. I think you have to, look at every situation. Obviously, the ideal is to say we have a solution to 5 different problems at the same time. That's the ideal. So it's the health, the education, whether it's the environment or inequality or having more inclusivity for women or rural populations or the poor. But that is sort of wonderful. I think unless you deal with it case by case, come up with specific solutions to specific problems at the same time as you're very cognizant of the broader situation and the broader policy, we will be going, I'm using circular in a different way than you said, and not ending up anywhere. And so I think that you do need the circular and you do need the ability to look multi-dimensional at a problem, but at the same time be very practical. What we need also, and that's, I think, where we are today, at CGI, thinking about also practical solutions to these problems. And you need both types of people to come together a little bit more. There's a huge gap between these two groups.
Neil Ghosh over here from SNB.
Thank you. You both talked about the need.
Wait for a mic. You have a mic.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. You both discussed the need for the involvement of public sector, which I couldn't agree more. And you also talked about capacity building, institutional, as without that, no commitment will be fulfilled. So the question to you is what we have seen in our work in inclusive business and impact investing, and we actually have an Inclusive Business Challenge Fund in Vietnam funded by DFID, is there is not as much funding for the technical assistance part, which will help the institutional building you're talking about. So do you see that's changing as we move forward to make some of these new innovative models successful? Thank you.
Of course, in this connection, we are benefiting very much from the support of the partner countries. Even for the implementation of the initiative on ASEAN integration, we have support from many of the partner countries. Funding projects. In the new 4 ASEAN member countries, in terms of capacity building and training for officials to participate more in the actively and more effectively in ASEAN affairs, and also in the negotiations between ASEAN and our partner countries. For example, in the trade negotiations for the free trade agreements. So that's very important, of course. And back to the point that you mentioned. We are perhaps the most diverse regional organization, and in the process of community building and integration, we are also cooperating with and learning from the other regional organizations. So what we say is, we learn a lot from others in what to do and what not to do. We have to design our programs, our measures, with the suits our, the particular, the specific conditions, and that would be, a factor ensuring the success.
I was just going to say, it's also like early venture, right? In early venture, you do have some, they don't call it technical assistance, which is what we call it, but they do that. And if you look at the World Bank, at least has always traditionally had hundreds of millions in money that could be used for technical assistance. The question is, how does it get used? Because the Norwegians and the Scandinavians and the Japanese and others give quite a big pool of money to the bank to be used, and I'm sure other multilaterals have other pools, to be used for technical assistance or for project preparation. Places like Ford Foundation will have early project preparation. It will be small amounts, but that has always been, it's almost like early venture investing. But you're absolutely right, it is critical for the success.
Got some more questions from there? Yes, over here. Wait for the mic.
How widely accepted among business schools and private equity groups are the new formulas that you mentioned for computing growth and potential growth that relate to not just capital and productivity? Is it because I think it would certainly stir a lot of long-term growth if we could get people thinking like you do.
I think if you just saw Laura Tyson, who just got the prize, and at the Haas School, I think they really think about these things. I think a lot of schools are thinking more and more. I think the issue is that people who are running investment banks or running private equity funds or venture funds have not just gone through schools. There are people who work for them who have, but the people who run investment funds, generally the model has been, I make money first, then I do good. And I think we need that to change so that you can see you can do both at the same time. And that will be the new population. It will be their children. It will be the young people who've gone, who are just going through school and thinking this way.
We could discuss these topics for a long time. There's one thing I want to close on, which is it's bringing in a potential externality. These questions that we've been grappling with are hard to deal with even in the best of circumstances with the most benign of environments. In and around ASEAN, in and around the question of international development institutions, geopolitics has been occasionally rearing its ugly head, whether in the South and East China Seas, whether in the formation of the AIIB. Do you guys worry at all that the challenge, that trying to achieve progress on the challenges that we've been talking about today will be affected by geopolitical tensions in ways that maybe we haven't been quite as concerned with over the last couple of decades?
Yes, so far in ASEAN, in our region, we have been able to benefit from the relative, stability and peace and security in the region. But right now, while we are focusing on, development on the process of building community, we are already facing a very difficult, sensitive, and I would say also very complicated situation. That of the tension arising from the territorial dispute in South China Sea. And in ASEAN, we see this as not only an issue of resolution of sovereignty claim, but also one of ensuring regional peace and stability, that of ensuring maritime security, and that of ensuring safety of navigation. Given the fact that it is there in the South China Sea, you see the most important, the longest and the largest international sea lanes, with the operation of almost every major trading country in the world. And so if anything erupts there, it would be the most dangerous development, affecting not only the peace and stability in the region, for ASEAN, for the neighboring countries, but for the whole world. And in this connection, we hope to be able to continue to enjoy the support of the international community for the legitimate ASEAN position on the solution of the South China Sea, which is a 6-point principle that ASEAN adopted back in 2012, that of respect for international law, that of respect for the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and the principle of peaceful solution of dispute, the principle of self-restraint, and the principle of, not changing the status quo, which was reflected in a declaration of conduct by parties in South China Sea that ASEAN and China adopted back in 2002, and also that of moving, early to the conclusion of a new code of conduct, would be for ASEAN a legally binding instrument, able not only to prevent, also to manage such incidents that are now taking place in South China Sea.
Okay. And Afsaneh, quick last word from you. AIIB, threat or opportunity?
Resource drain, but look at President Xi's visit here. His family can't stand the air in China, okay? His children can't, his relatives can't, his friends can't, so they do need to make it cleaner. So on the one hand, yes, it is going to be a resource drain and huge distraction and terrible, and we heard a great statement on that. The positive is even in that situation, people can't live in certain cities anymore and have to be positive and fix their problems, and that will generate projects that will actually be having the right rate of return.